Well, good afternoon, everybody. Great to be here on a snowy day here in Ottawa, which is kind of odd for April 27th, but here we are. My name is Paul Wagner. I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister responsible for strategy and transformation within the Treasury Board Secretariat of Canada, and also the Interim Chief Technology Officer for the federal government. And really pleased to be part of the Cybersecurity and Identity Summit this year and get a chance to talk about digital identity. A really important topic, I think, for us to have some dialogue around, and is very topical, in terms of the government's move towards digital government. I think many of you will have seen that within the minister for Treasury Board, her mandate letter stipulates that she's to set up a national digital identity program, and I'm the accountable executive to make sure that that actually happens. And so I've been working very closely with the provinces and territories as we move that agenda forward, and really just want to give you a bit of a sense of sort of the current state where we're at today, some of the initial thinking around this, and then certainly hopefully that will spur some discussions and some ideas. I think there's a possibility for you guys to ask some questions in the chat. I certainly recommend that. We're going to try and see. I think we're working through some technology newness here and figuring out if we can do that. But please feel free to post your questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to get to them and answer them. So, Mark, if you want to bring up maybe the first slide here, or the slides, and I'll bounce through and just kind of give you a sense. Let's try this here. Not sure if this is going to make it better or worse. Sorry about this, folks. That's probably not a lot better. All right, let's, Mark, if you want to bring those down, let me try again here. All right, here's take two. All right, that's perfect. Just using that to actually do some filler on time here. So if, looking at some of the options that we have in front of us today from a digital identity perspective, and I had the privilege yesterday of speaking to a parliamentary committee, which was on actually budget 2022, but a number of the members around that table wanted to discuss digital ID. And I think it's a real testimony to the fact that a lot of the folks in the audience, you're from private sector, different public sector organizations around the country, and digital ID is in many cases becoming a reality. BC, Alberta have implemented digital IDs, and many other organizations and constituencies are considering implementing it from Ontario to out to the East Coast as well. And the questions really were around what does this mean for citizens, and what does having a digital ID actually mean? That was one of the pointed questions I got yesterday from one of the members of Parliament, and what that really did was amplify some of the discussions I've been having with folks around the country about digital ID. And I think one of the things that we can all do is in our respective areas, whether we're in the the cyberspace area or the privacy space or digital ID provisioning, is explain to constituents and citizens and businesses what a digital identity is. I think a lot of times we go in with the understanding or the expectation that people know what we're talking about. And those of us that are in the mix and we're kind of thinking about how we implement this and the opportunities that digital identity is going to provide to the country, I think we sometimes leapfrog over some of the basic and foundational elements of what a digital identity is and what it isn't. And I mean, I likened it. I tweeted yesterday, we were talking about digital credentials, and most provinces that did have when they had vaccine passports to be able to get into restaurants and bars and places of public gathering, you on your iPhone, you had a digital credential that allowed you to get in, and there was an app on the other side that allowed you to that allowed them to figure out whether or not you were vaccinated according to the policy. And then you had to show your driver's license, health card, passport, some sort of physical proof of identity. And I use that as the example of saying, well, if you had a digital identity, you'd have that digital wallet where you'd have all of these credentials in there that would be bound back to your digital identity, and that it would be citizen controlled. And that's a really, really key element of this as we think about some of the privacy considerations around this and around some of the security considerations. So for us, and happy for anybody to find me on LinkedIn or Twitter and give me your thoughts and views on this if we can't get the chat going. But we're looking at digital identities and enabling the use of those digital identities by individuals and businesses to be able to obtain digital services from the public sector and across the economy. And it is really a pan-Canadian and pan-industry approach that we're taking. Certainly, we're looking at digital identity to be able to access government services, but also looking at building a national digital identity and trust infrastructure across the country so that we have a consistent approach for Canadians when they're using their digital IDs in the provinces, and also to allow for businesses. If you think about small and medium-sized enterprises, I know there's a number of those in the audience today as well, and making sure that they have access to a digital identity infrastructure that has a level of trust of government leveraging that same infrastructure. And I think that's one of the areas. This is not an infrastructure that's going to be built by the federal government only. This is a national project, national initiative, and does require the work of provinces, territories, municipalities in some cases. But the fact that it has the trust level of having governments leveraging it, that can give a lot of small and medium enterprises a leg up in terms of being able to leverage that. And if you think about that from a Canadian economy perspective, which we'll talk about a couple of slides in, what that looks like. So, some of our principles that we have that align or that, kind of guide what we're doing from a digital identity perspective: universal access, safety and security, absolutely paramount as we build out these systems. The security framework and security architecture is going to be paramount to the design. Control and consent. Really, it comes back to Canadians being able to control what data they're sharing, when they're using it, and understanding who's using their personal data and for what purposes. The idea that there's a master database somewhere that has all this information in it, that's one of the common misconceptions around this in terms of how this can be built. We talk about, I talked about yesterday around, the multi-factor authentication, the ability to have multiple layers of security to ensure that control of the digital IDs. Transparency, portability, interoperability, absolutely critical. We've got, as we've seen, we've got some jurisdictions, some provinces way out ahead. Others, looking at it and trying to understand how that would best serve their citizens, given the kind of services their provinces offer. But the element of a standards-based infrastructure and interoperability between the digital identity platforms and digital identity schemas that are created within provinces have to be interoperable, because the individual citizen that moves from Alberta to Quebec, out to Nova Scotia, that digital ID should be able to transfer with them, and they can avail themselves of the services not only in the federal government and potentially industry, but also the province that they're moving into and potentially out of. Obviously, open and modern digital government. We see this as a real cornerstone to the way that Canadians will begin to access government services. We actually have agreements today with ESDC and the two provinces as I mentioned, BC and Alberta. So if you have a BC or Alberta digital ID, you can log into your My Service Canada account and transact with the federal government. That's excellent. That's one service, and we'll talk about some of the challenges we have facing us today within the federal government from a scale perspective. But it's that type of model we want to be able to expand over the entire ecosystem of services the government offers. and then strong enforcement and accountability. So, if there are infringements, what are the penalties for that? So these are some of the things that we're thinking about. These are some of the principles. Again, I invite you to challenge me on some of those, offer some up that maybe are not on there. But those are some of the key ones that we're looking at as we move forward. On the next slide, let me try to get to that. I can see that moving slides here is going to be the bane of my existence. All right, let me stop again and hang on. You have to look at me while I go to my next slide here. My apologies for this, folks. New platform for me. All right, let's try this again. All right, Mark, you want to try that one? All right, I'll just keep it in this slide view, and hopefully everybody can see the slides here. And my apologies for my technical inability. So the current challenge from a government perspective, and this is again, I'll talk in a couple of minutes here about the realities from an industry perspective, or some of the possible realities in an industry perspective. But we have 33 government departments today that are offering roughly 270 online services and programs. And there's 56 online systems that Canadians have to log into, each with the own organization verifying their identity, and verifying their identity in varying ways. So, username, password, some using multi-factor authentication, some using, as I mentioned, the digital IDs from other provinces. But that's not acceptable, right? I mean, if you think about digital government, thinking about serving Canadians, thinking about serving, immigrants looking to move to Canada, become Canadians, we need to be much more seamless in terms of the way that we authenticate users and then ultimately deliver services to them. That'll be the next hill that we'll need to look at. But as I mentioned, this is sort of cornerstone to get us into those further discussions. So, as it says, up there right now is, different username, password for almost every department in online government service. You repeatedly have to tell the government the same information to verify identity and apply for those services. Some of our services, you actually have to wait for 5 to 10 days to verify identity through an in-person or mail-based process. So, you apply, I think the CRA is an example of this, where you apply for an account and then, something shows up in your mailbox. It's a little bit like a landline, and how often do you go and check your mailbox to see what kind of mail you get. Departments and programs, from an internal perspective, we shouldn't have to invest in redundant systems. And so as each department starts to build out their digital service platforms, they shouldn't have to go out and build out a single or their own bespoke identity verification platform. And so having a Government of Canada platform to be able to do that is really, what we're looking at doing. And again, that Government of Canada platform is predicated on a pan-Canadian trust infrastructure that is underpinned actually by the pan-Canadian framework. So the idea that we deal with this helps deal with fraudulent security vulnerabilities, that having each department building out bespoke infrastructure, and having a consistent service experience for Canadians. That's something that this will help to drive towards. Again, yesterday in that committee meeting, I spoke about how as we start to consolidate our identity validation and ensuring that we know who we're talking to on the other end of a device or the other end of a transaction, we can then start to move towards a common platform where you'd have a suite of services that would be available to you, and then potentially beyond that is having some common data about a Canadian and saying, if you log in, again, consent driven, here's your address, here's the phone number that you would have on file, and that gets propagated across all the different departmental services. Today, that's done again in a very bespoke manner. And we know these challenges are not only are realistic and realized in the federal government, but they actually exist across many different jurisdictions in the private sector. For government, the bigger challenge is, a lot of times we're seen as one organization, regardless of which department is providing a service. And so we have that consolidated user experience that's really critical for Canadians as we move forward. So happily that worked. Looking at some of the building blocks here in terms of what we can do. As I mentioned, this is built on the Pan Canadian Trust framework, and so you'd have identity issuers in the spaces of the provinces. They're the sort of provincial digital authorities right now, and we see that as being an ongoing space that they're going to occupy. There would be federal digital identities. So if you think about immigrants to Canada, they become Canadian before they become a provincial citizen. So Canada would still have to be able to give out digital identities, and we also would want to ensure that digital identities were available to Canadians in provinces that potentially aren't as advanced. So we'd want to be able to apply those digital identities or assign those digital identities. And then from other organizations, so identities from banks, from other institutions that have trusted digital identities that become part of that framework. Those are all the identity issuers. Then we would have an identity platform that would, and here we're kind of showing both parts of the ecosystem. One for the digital ID platform for government services, and then you see the identity consumers over on the right-hand side. An example, small example, ESDC, CRA, and so forth. But then that connection is made to the national digital trust infrastructure, which then, through digital credentials and wallets, allows you to access other jurisdictions and other organizations in the digital economy. So really thinking about, how can this benefit Canadians? And one of the things that we're going to be looking at in this calendar year is doing some work around consultations with the public around digital ID, what that looks like, what it means to Canadians, what are their concerns and so forth. So we're going to be able to gather that information, that corpus of information. There's a lot of information that's already been gathered through the provinces, and we're going to, we're working, as I mentioned, quite closely with our with our provincial and territorial colleagues on this, and equally importantly, with not only the CIOs and the digital leaders within those provinces, but also the privacy leads in the provinces, as well as our own privacy commissioner within the federal government. Critical to all this is privacy through all of this, through all of these transactions. And we saw when we were putting out and developing the Canadian vaccine passport to allow for international travel, the vaccine passports were being allocated by province, but we needed to get to a place where we had a Canadian recognized standard that we would be able to use. And we worked through different options in terms of how that would be delivered. But regardless of what option it was, whether it was where we landed, which was, applying sort of the Canadian standard and our frame around each of the provincial vaccine passports, it was working with the privacy commissioners in those provinces, along with the CIOs, that we got to a place that was consistent for all Canadians. And that's going to be really critical as we put forth a national digital ID infrastructure, both for the economy, as I mentioned, and for the federal public service. This just gives you a bit of an overview of some of the key touch points that we see. And I know this is probably a bit of an eye chart for all of you. Hopefully you're looking at this on 65-inch screens, wherever you're watching from. But these are, as we start to work through some of the departments and agencies and thinking about some of the services that we offer to Canadians today, these are some of the areas that we think would really have the biggest impact. As we say at the bottom, there's a cascading effect, or an expected cascading effect into Canada's industry landscape. And so, if we look a little further into where this could lead, if we have a pan-Canadian digital identity ecosystem, we could actually reduce some regulatory friction. We could enable digital services across the economy. And then, we looked at some possible areas in different industry sectors. And, again, there's a few hundred folks online, I think. Find your sector, and I've probably not done it justice here in terms of some of the impacts that digital identity can have. But there have been some studies done that talk about an economic value of leveraging digital ID of somewhere in the range of 3 to 13% of GDP by 2030. So we're looking out not that far anymore, I guess 8 years out. But thinking about what can having that kind of digital infrastructure do for Canada, for Canadians, and more importantly, and from this lens, for Canadian businesses as we come back from a period of economic downturn for sure. This is an area I think, and one of the reasons why it's in our minister's mandate is to really think about how that ecosystem could benefit Canadian businesses and Canadian enterprises. So that's the crux of kind of what I wanted to talk about today. I don't see any questions here in the chat. So let me wrap up with a couple of maybe some key thoughts and things for you to think about, bring back to your industries, bring back to your organizations, and you will definitely have a chance to engage with us as we move forward. One is around the centralized versus decentralized model for digital ID. Looking at from an architectural perspective, what makes the most sense? How do we ensure the greatest level of security and privacy, and ensure that Canadians have consent and control over their information and their identity clearly. But how do we ensure that we build this into a technology model that is sustainable over time? Because new technologies will come and go. We're looking. Does blockchain make sense in this space? Does the decentralized model of provinces holding the validation keys? So there's a bunch of different questions that we have to ask as we move down the architecture path on this. But one thing is that it's it absolutely needs to be user centric, and think about the constituents that you work with, and scanning that that population and understanding, I guess first gaining an understanding of what they know about digital ID. Back to my opening remarks, and then I'm looking at what we need to do from a consultation perspective to make sure that we hit the mark from a public expectations perspective. Because we've seen, varying degrees of success in other jurisdictions around the world, where digital ID was implemented with success, some with failure. And I think, some people will point to Saskatchewan that's kind of put the brakes on their digital ID activities for now, looking to see, okay, so what are the privacy implications? What are some of the broader implications? And so, while we're engaged with each of the provinces, certainly the provinces have ambitions of their own, and aligning to those and making sure that we all move forward in a consistent fashion, I think is really, really key on this. Privacy and security, I can't overstate that. That's germane to any of the architectures that we put forth, and standards based. The standards that we apply, but amongst the provinces and amongst the private sector organizations, really critical that those are open, understood, can be leveraged. And then we need to look beyond our own country. And I think dealing with the challenges of the vastness of Canada and the breadth of what we offer in terms of services, private and public, is a daunting enough challenge. But we can't lose sight of the fact that there's an international component to this as well. And so, how do our standards within Canada fit within some of the international standards that are out there? So, hopefully I've given you a bit of a view in terms of some of the initial thinking that we have around this. I don't want to make it sound by any stretch that we've got all of the answers, in the bag. We're working very closely with, a number of organizations. DIAC, who I know is, Joni was on here before talking about, I believe, digital ID. I'm sure digital ID. The CIO Strategy Council. We're working with Standards Council of Canada. So, we're bringing together all of the key players around this. And certainly within government, bringing together ISED, Global Affairs, ourselves and Treasury Board from an overall program oversight perspective. It is quite exciting to see what the possibilities are, and we're starting to see some real traction around the dialogue with our minister, clearly with that mandate being in her mandate letter, and some of the dialogue that she's having with her colleagues around the cabinet table around the importance of digital ID and what this can actually mean for Canadians and Canadian businesses. So hopefully I've given you a little bit to think about, maybe created more questions than answers, and that's good because that's where we're at here in this process. I think with the folks that are around this table and around other tables, all having this a consistent dialogue, and when we come out with the standards in terms of how this will be put forth after having consulted, I think then it'll be to actually iterate through and work through, put the systems in place, put some of the frameworks in place to allow this to be used. It's not a big bang approach. It's not going to be wake up on April 1st of 2023 or 2024 and everybody has a digital ID. But how do we actually learn from the implementations that we do have in BC and Alberta, and then as we move forward in other provinces, and move forward for the benefit of, like I said before, all Canadians and all Canadian businesses, and for those that are looking to come to Canada. So with that, I'll sign off. I want to thank the organizers of the event. Apart from my own technical difficulties, which I apologize for once again. Great event. Always tough to do these things in a virtual format. I think we're on the cusp of being able to move back to in person, which I'm looking forward to. Looking forward to seeing all of you again face to face. Walk up on a stage. I'd be able to have this kind of dialogue. See some hands up, some questions, and enjoy some of that dialogue. Probably next time we'll be able to do that. But for now, hopefully this was beneficial. And thank you all very much, and have a great